it has endured.
Our long national nightmare is over.
Give me a break. That's a bunch of malarkey.
Hello, welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barrett.
Hey, I'm Chaz Cidello.
This week, Trump on trial.
We're going to talk to his former impeachment lawyer, Alan Dershowitz, about the case against America's 45th president.
We'll also catch up with former Senator Heidi Heitkamp about the prospect of unity in this divided Congress.
I'm going to be looking at the debate over lifting the minimum wage, but first...
the second impeachment of Donald J. Trump. Oh, for f***'s sake.
This week's second impeachment trial of former President Donald Trump began with a video. In total, 13 minutes and 21 seconds of the words of Donald Trump on the day that a violent mob attacked the Capitol building, intercut with the actions of his supporters. It was a vivid reminder of what led us to this moment. For the first time, an American president impeached for incitement of insurrection on January 6, adding to the drama the fact that the US Capitol building, the scene of the crime, is also the scene of the trial. And the targets of the attack, members of Congress, are now sitting as the jurors. The emotion of the past 5 weeks was inescapable, and for House Impeachment Leader Jamie Raskin, whose son took his own life just a week before the attack, almost overwhelming at times. Raskin's daughter was with him on the day of the attack, forced to barricade herself in an office for over an hour, fearing for her life.
She said, "Dad, I don't want to come back to the Capitol." Of all the terrible, brutal things I saw and I heard on that day, and since then, that one hit me the hardest. That and watching someone use an American flagpole, with the flag still on it, to spear and pummel one of our police officers ruthlessly, mercilessly, tortured by a pole with a flag on it that he was defending.
Before the trial could get underway, arguments and a vote were conducted to determine whether it should proceed. Was it even constitutional to try a former president using a process largely designed to provide a mechanism to remove a sitting president from office? Well, that's where we got a history lesson, with a lot of attention being focused on one William Belknap, the Secretary of War under President Ulysses S. Grant, who was busted for taking kickbacks and tried to resign to avoid impeachment in 1876, but Congress pushed ahead, impeached him anyway, and held a Senate trial after determining they did have jurisdiction. Democratic Congressman Joe Neguse also gave us a clue as to why he thinks it's worth bothering with this trial when the jury is basically presumed to be rigged.
Belknap ultimately was not convicted, but only after a thorough public inquiry into his misconduct, which created a record of his wrongdoing. It ensured his accountability and deterred anyone else from considering such corruption by making clear that it was intolerable.
They also made an interesting point, and that is that every British impeachment during the Founding Fathers' lifetimes were of former officials. So theoretically, at least they wouldn't have found this process strange at all. Nevertheless, that Belknap case that you mentioned panned out exactly like this case seems like it's going to. They debated whether it's constitutional to hold a trial for a former official. They had a close-ish, quite partisan vote and decided, yeah, that's okay. And then the people who lost that vote used that issue as a reason to acquit Belknap. History repeating, John.
Looking that way, Chaz. But leading the former president's defence now, Bruce Castor, himself a former Pennsylvania district attorney and long-time prosecutor, but he started with a pretty unusual admission.
I'll be quite frank with you. We changed what we were going to do on account that we thought that the House manager's presentation was well done.
Turns out he needn't to have bothered explaining that he'd thrown away his speech. It soon became pretty clear that Bruce was just kind of riffing with a few notes scrawled on a yellow legal pad. Things got a bit weird.
And boy, this is a diverse group. We still know what records are, right? On the thing you put the needle down on and you play it. I worked in this building 40 years ago. I got lost then, and I still do.
And And by that point, we were all kind of lost. But while the defence team condemned the attack itself, they argued that Trump could not be held responsible and that if he really did anything so bad, a criminal court should take up the matter, not Congress. Their constitutional argument has been widely criticised, though. And Defence Attorney David Chauvin had a video exhibit of his own to play to try and show that Democrats have been looking for any excuse to impeach Donald Trump pretty much since day one.
It is a function of the insatiable lust for impeachment in the House for the past 4 years. Consider this.
I want to say this for Donald Trump, who I may well be voting to impeach.
Donald Trump has already done a number of things which legitimately raise the question of impeachment.
I don't respect this president, and I will fight every day until he is impeached.
That is grounds to start impeachment proceedings.
Yeah, maybe they did jump the gun just a little bit. But in the end, 6 Republican senators voted with all 50 Democrats to declare the trial constitutional and to proceed. Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, Mitt Romney, Ben Sasse and Pat Toomey. They'd all voted the same way on Rand Paul's earlier constitutionality vote. There was one fresh convert, Senator Bill Cassidy, Republican of Louisiana, and he was scathing about Trump's defence team.
President Trump's team were disorganized. They did everything they could but to talk about the question at hand. And when they talked about it, they kind of glided over it, almost as if they were embarrassed of their arguments. Now, if I'm an impartial juror, and one side's doing a great job, and the other side's doing a terrible job on the issue at hand, as an impartial juror, I'm going to vote for the side that did the good job.
We'll see if any other Republicans follow suit. That first vote could well be a preview of how this trial is going to end next week, with only 5 or 6 Republicans joining with the Democrats voting to convict. Well short of the 67 votes needed, and Bill Cassidy has already been targeted by his fellow Louisiana Republicans. Party members in East Baton Rouge condemning Senator Cassidy's actions in the strongest manner, saying he does not represent the people of this state or the Republican Party. Yeah, he actually does both, but claiming that Trump, who they call a great president, has been the subject of outrageous, scurrilous and false attacks, Chaz.
Yeah, there's also been some focus on Mitch McConnell's vote, in that he was single-handedly responsible for this trial taking place after Trump left the presidency. He refused to break the Senate recess, if you recall. But then he went and voted that it was unconstitutional to hold this trial after Trump left the presidency. Seems pretty dodge. But now he's apparently telling people he hasn't made up his mind how he's going to vote for the actual trial.
An old tease.
Okay, but if he is undecided, he is one of the very few. The New York Times surveyed 99 senators before the trial began, and 36 Republicans had already decided they were going to acquit Trump. Enough for, as you say, John, a foregone conclusion. I might add, the 36 Democrats had already made up their mind as well, but to convict. But there is a reason why it's a tough call for Republicans to vote against Trump. 70% of Republicans believe that Trump was justified in trying to overturn or dismiss the 2020 election results. They think he was doing the right thing. So it's pretty hard for a Republican to ignore that from their base. Although some have gone to extraordinary lengths to get Trump off the hook.
Is this another diversionary operation? Is this meant to deflect away from potentially what the speaker knew and when she knew it? I don't know, but I'm suspicious.
So it was Nancy Pelosi who let the riot happen somehow?
She didn't stop it, Chaz. Facts are facts.
Okay. Something tells me that Ron Johnson did not enter this trial with an open mind.
Yeah, well, yesterday saw the Democrat House managers get to the substance of their case for impeaching Donald Trump in the first place. The alleged incitement to insurrection, which they said was about much more than the words that the president spoke at that January 6th rally at the Ellipse in front of the White House. The Democrats, including Eric Swalwell, argued it was the final act in a concerted effort to discredit and overturn the result of last November's election.
This was never about one speech. He built this mob over many months with repeated messaging until they believed that they had been robbed of their vote and they would do anything to stop the certification. He made them believe that their victory was stolen and incited them so he could use them to steal the election for himself.
And they had a lot of videos to try and prove their point.
This election was rigged.
This is tyranny against the people of the United States, and we are not standing for it anymore.
if we don't root out the fraud, the tremendous and horrible fraud that's taken place in our 2020 election, we don't have a country anymore.
The left lies, they cheat and they steal. They are ruthless and they are hell-bent on getting power and control by any means necessary.
A lot of it we had seen before, but Delegate Stacey Plaskett of the Virgin Islands showed previously unseen video of police officer Eugene Goodman turning Senator Mitt Romney back away from the mob.
Officer Goodman passes Senator Mitt Romney and directs him to turn around in order to get to safety.
And all of those videos were about a lot more than just reminding the senators like Mitt Romney sitting in judgment of Trump about what he said and what they experienced. It's also a clue, I think, about what the primary objective for Democrats and a handful of Republicans that are siding with them at the moment is. And that is to remind the American people, the millions tuning in every day, even if they can't convict Donald Trump and disqualify him, they can discredit him, and they can also discredit the Republicans that are defending his conduct at the time.
Politics and impeachment trial. Well, I never. Look, it's easy to show a heap of riot footage and call it chilling, but to make their case, the Democrats have to tie Trump directly to the riot. How can you prove he incited them? How can you show that that was what Trump wanted to happen? And why wasn't Trump just using his freedom of speech like any number of other politicians have done, including Democrats? Let's start with the free speech argument. Now, I thought Manager Raskin was pretty convincing here, drawing an analogy to the famous case about yelling fire in a theatre.
This case is much worse than someone who falsely shouts fire in a crowded theater. It's more like a case where the town fire chief, who's paid to put out fires, sends a mob not to yell fire in a crowded theater, but to actually set the theater on fire. And who then, when the fire alarms go off and the calls start flooding into the fire department, asking for help, does nothing but sit back, encourage the mob to continue its rampage, and watch the fire spread on TV with glee and delight. So then we say this fire chief should never be allowed to hold this public job again, and you're fired and you're permanently disqualified, and he objects. And he says, we're violating his free speech rights just because he's pro-mob or pro-fire or whatever it might be.
A bit cheeky, but effective. The fact is you can be fired for saying things that violate your duty, even though I expect Trump's defense is going to be saying more about that tomorrow. But how did the House managers show that Trump's speech crossed the line? Well, first they tried to show it wasn't just one speech. There was a pattern of messaging that abused his powers for months. He pressured officials to unlawfully change the election result. He pressured officials to unlawfully ignore the courts. He pressured the Justice Department to unlawfully launch investigations. He tried to unlawfully stop the election certifications. And then he pressured the Senate and Mike Pence to unlawfully reject those certifications, all culminating in an intentional targeting of January 6th, even with its own ad campaign.
He spent $50 million from his legal defense fund on these ads to stop the steal and amplify his message. They were released nationally, played in video ads, online advertising, and targeted text messages. They used the same words and phrases that President Trump had been spreading for months, that the election was full of fraud, to stop the steal. But now they had a specific purpose. How do we know that purpose? These ads were designed to run all the way up to January 5, and then they stopped. This was purposeful and deliberate planning to target his base to rally around that day.
Then they tried to show that the rioters thought they were following Trump's orders. The rioters made no attempts to hide their identity. They were very open on social media about what they'd done, and they explicitly said that they were invited there by the president.
You don't have to take my word for it that the insurrectionists acted at Donald Trump's direction. They said so. We were invited by the President of the United
States! I thought I was following my president. I thought I was following what we were called to do.
We're outnumbered. There's a fucking million of us out there, and we are listening to Trump. You're the boss.
And by the way, 24 people charged in the attack specifically cited Trump as to why they took action in Washington. Fine, but how do you show that Trump was willfully inciting violence? Well, First, they showed how Trump talks to his people when he wants something.
On November 5th, he tweeted, in all capital letters, as if shouting commands, quote, "Stop the count. Stop the fraud." I also want you to remember these tweets for another reason. Because that's what it looks like when Donald Trump wants people to stop doing something.
And then they showed how Trump talked to his people on the day of the riots.
When he wanted to incite his supporters to show up on January 6th, President Trump tweeted 16 times between midnight on January 5th and his noon rally speech the next day. 16 times to get them to do something he wanted. But when the violence started, he never once said the one thing everyone around him was begging him to say. Stop the attack.
So, even after it all blew up on January 6th, Trump did not condemn the attack, and he didn't even ask them to stop, other than some belated wishy-washy, keep peaceful type tweets. And that's not how Trump talks when he actually wants to stop something. They also noted that Trump did nothing to deploy the National Guard, which is his duty to do. Mike Pence had to activate the National Guard instead. And finally, even when it was all over and it was clear that everyone on the right had been another disaster, this was Trump's concluding thought.
At 6:01 p.m. on January 6th, he tweeted, quote, "These are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously and viciously stripped away from great patriots who've been badly and unfairly treated for so long." Ending with, "Remember this day forever. Great patriots, go home with love and in peace. Remember this day forever." He's saying to them, you did good. He's not regretful. He's not grieving. He's not sad. He's not angry about the attack. He's celebrating it. He's commemorating it.
So that is how they tried to establish that Trump actually wanted this to happen. Whether they were successful or not is up to you.
Yeah, and about 50 Republican senators. The Democrat case against Donald Trump wrapped up earlier today, although 15 of those 50 Republican senators decided they had better things to do than actually show up. This is how impeachment manager Raskin closed their case this morning, reminding senators they did ask former President Trump to attend his trial and he declined, and then he set out the questions that he would have asked the president and which he now says Trump's lawyers must address.
One, why did President Trump not tell his supporters to stop the attack on the Capitol as soon as he learned of it? Why did President Trump do nothing to stop the attack for at least 2 hours after the attack began? As our constitutional commander-in-chief, why did he do nothing to send help to our overwhelmed and besieged law enforcement officers for at least 2 hours on January 16th after the attack began? On January 6th, why did President Trump not at any point that day condemn the violent insurrection and the insurrectionists?
The defence arguments are expected to use only about half of the 16 hours that had been set aside for them, and they will wrap up tomorrow. Meanwhile, one of the other defence arguments so far was, if you really think that Trump is guilty of a crime, take him to court, not to the US Senate. Well, we may in fact still see that because the district attorney in the state of Georgia, Fani Willis, this week opened an investigation into Trump's attempts to overturn Georgia's election results, including that phone call that he made to Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, which Mr. Trump pressured him to find enough votes to help him reverse his loss. Experts say that Trump may have run afoul of state laws, including criminal solicitation to commit election fraud, which carries a potential penalty of at least 1 year in prison.
Yes, although it's very hard to prove that Trump intended to commit fraud. Still, that investigation might be of comfort to Liz Cheney, who seems to have gone into don't give an F mode by heavily implying that Trump should be targeted with criminal investigations.
There will be a massive criminal investigation of everything that happened on January 6th and in the days before. People will want to know exactly what the president was doing. They will want to know, for example, whether the tweet that he sent out calling Vice President Pence a coward while the attack was underway, whether that tweet, for example, was a premeditated effort to provoke violence. There are a lot of questions that have to be answered.
Although admittedly, she does still have some way to go before she heads into Maxine Waters territory.
As a matter of fact, he absolutely should be charged with premeditated murder because of the lives that were lost with this invasion, with this insurrection.
Maybe a bridge too far, John?
Yeah, maybe. Let's get a possible preview of the former president's defence from a former member of his legal team, Alan Dershowitz, Harvard Constitutional Law Emeritus Professor, who appeared for President Trump at his first impeachment trial last year. Professor Dershowitz, welcome to Planet America.
My pleasure, thank you.
We have heard a lot of arguments so far in this trial about the very constitutionality of trying a now former president. What is your view on that?
I think the Constitution is clear. It says that the president shall be removed upon impeachment. Removed, the president. He is not the president. He can't be removed. You can't put private citizens on trial in the Senate. That's called a bill of attainder. The legislature is not allowed to try individuals. And if you could put him on trial, why not put Jimmy Carter on trial and Bill Clinton on trial and Nikki Haley, if she's going to run against Biden next time, put her on trial. The Senate doesn't have a roving commission to put private citizens on trial, so I think it's unconstitutional.
Professor, Manager Raskin concluded today by saying, look, the constitutional question, we discussed it, we voted on it, the Senate held that for the purposes of this proceeding, we say it's okay, so don't bring that up anymore. Let's just talk about the merits. If you were the defence, would you accept that, or would you keep on arguing that's an illegitimate trial?
I would completely keep on arguing that because I would expect to get a number of Republican senators to agree with that. That's what happened in the only other trial in which a cabinet member has ever been tried after leaving office, the Belknap case. The Senate voted that they had jurisdiction, then they voted to acquit him on the ground that they didn't have jurisdiction. So it's a completely valid argument, and I'm sure the president's lawyers will argue tomorrow that there are two reasons for acquitting him. Number one, the Senate doesn't have jurisdiction if you can get 10 or 15 or 20 senators who agree with that. And then number two, that even if they have jurisdiction, you cannot convict anyone based on the exercise of free speech First Amendment rights. And all you need is a combination of reasons, and if you don't have the 2/3 vote, you lose, and he's acquitted.
How confident are you that that will be argued effectively? Day one, Bruce Castor in particular, he wasn't great, was he?
Oh, that overstates it. He was worse than not great. I think David Stone will pick up the ball, and I hope he will be able to make the arguments effectively. Perhaps Castor will improve his level of argumentation, but the arguments on their own are very strong. There are cases on the First Amendment that say you can advocate. And what happened is this president, he didn't incite. What he did was to invite. He said, go down to the Capitol, march on the Capitol, give them hell, fight, but do it peacefully and patriotically. That's not incitement. Moreover, the majority of people who heard him didn't go. They went home. And the majority of people who went down to the Capitol didn't break in. And the majority of people who broke in didn't commit violence. So that's not incitement. It's not like shouting fire in a theater. If you shout fire, everybody leaves. Nobody thinks about it. Shouting fire is a directive to the legs, not the mind. Here, Trump spoke to people's minds. Some listened to him, some didn't listen to him. Under the First Amendment, that's protected speech.
Professor, the House managers were arguing that it wasn't just about the speech, it was about the months before the speech, or it's like a pattern of behaviour. How do you feel about that argument?
Well, I think that helps Trump a lot. It makes it clear that this was part of a politically protected argument. The president believed, I think he was dead wrong, but the president believed that the election was stolen from him. Under the First Amendment, he has the right to be wrong. The First Amendment allows you to say the earth is flat as much as it allows you to say the earth is round. And so he was entitled to have that belief. And going back in time and putting the speech in context only strengthens the First Amendment argument. It shows that it wasn't an incitement. It was part of a process of politically opposing the election. Wrong in my view, but constitutionally protected.
Politically opposing it before the election had even taken place, of course, that discrediting, that saying, I'm not necessarily going to commit to a peaceful transfer of power. He was saying that back in July of last year.
That's why I voted against him. That's why I'm not a Trump supporter. That's why I never supported his policies. That's why I supported his opponents. I think he shouldn't have been elected president the first time. I voted against him. That's not a reason for impeaching him. I am a liberal Democrat who opposed Trump, but who strongly believes that his rights under the Constitution permit him to make a fool of himself and make statements that shouldn't have been made. There's a big difference between what he should have done and what he had a constitutional right to do. Look, I've defended the rights of Nazis to march through Skokie, of communists to call for a totalitarian government, of the Chicago 7 to yell blood in the street. I don't agree with any of them. That's not my job as a lawyer. I'm not pretending I'm the lawyer who's on Rake, the great Australian series. He'll defend anybody. I won't defend anybody. I use only ethical means in my own defense. But nonetheless, he's right when he says the job of a lawyer is to put forward a plausible defense, not necessarily to agree with the client's point of view.
So leaving aside this particular article, is there anything from the president's conduct after the election that you believe was potentially impeachable conduct?
No, I think the closer case might be the phone call that he made to the Secretary of State. If he intended the Secretary of State to create new votes for him, that would be an impeachable offense. But by finding, if he meant there were ballots cast, they haven't been found, they haven't been counted, go look for them, that would not have been an impeachable offense. Impeachable offenses are very limited. Treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. It doesn't mean misconduct. It doesn't mean maladministration. It doesn't mean making stupid statements. It means that you have to commit criminal type behavior. And I just don't think the Democrats have made that case.
Do you, Professor, think that whether it is that Georgia case, which is now being investigated, or anything else particularly in the president's sort of post-election behaviour, may lead to either civil or criminal action in his post-presidency?
That wouldn't surprise me. New York State is investigating him very carefully on taxes and business practices. And remember, we have a precedent. We had a vice president early in our period of time named Aaron Burr. If you've seen the play Hamilton, you know all about Aaron Burr. He, after he was vice president, went down and created an insurrection. Nobody thought of impeaching him. He was out of office. They indicted him. They tried him for treason. That's the way the Constitution intended it. If you're out of office, put him on trial. Let him have a jury trial. Let him have all of his rights. And if he's convicted, fine. He has no immunity from conviction. In the Aaron Burr case, he was acquitted. And I think President Trump would be acquitted if he were charged with this conduct. But that's the better process, not impeachment.
If we look at the House managers case on their own terms for the moment, they broke it down into three elements. They said the violence was foreseeable, that Trump encouraged it, and that Trump did so willfully. Do you think, as far as the facts go, they argued that well or not?
Yes, I thought they argued it very effectively. I really thought they deserved an Oscar and an Emmy for the way they put together the films of what happened in the Capitol, but they deserve a B- for their constitutional law. I think they were very persuasive. The president did a terrible thing by making that speech. He may very well have contributed to some people going into the Capitol and doing terrible things. That's a far cry from the kind of incitement that's required to take you outside of the protection of the First Amendment. So A+ in advocacy, A+ in videography, and B- in constitutional law.
It's interesting that you're grading, of course, Professor, because Jamie Raskin, as I understand it, is a former student of yours.
Former student of mine, and I defended his father, who was charged with incitement against the Vietnam War. And we won that case on First Amendment grounds. And if Jamie Raskin's arguments on the First Amendment had prevailed, his father would have been convicted. His father also was involved in the Pentagon Papers case. I defended the Pentagon Papers case. And we won the Pentagon Papers case on First Amendment grounds. So Jamie Raskin is arguing against the very principles that helped his own father. You can't have free speech for me and Daddy, but no free speech for you, President Trump. So I think that his own history should have inclined him to be more sensitive to First Amendment rights. Remember, he too, in 2016, opposed the election of President Trump. He challenged it. He was on the floor of the House opposing it. So the hypocrisy here is rampant and the partisanship is rampant. We have to have one standard for all.
On that question of free speech, as it specifically applies, I know it applies equally to Americans under the Constitution, but as it applies to future presidencies, there's this question of, well, if Trump can get away with all of that stuff that he said and contributing to, if not inciting, the violent mob that led to the death of 7 people, where do we draw the line? Or do we simply not draw the line in the United States? You can say what you like, short of the fire in a crowded theatre.
Well, there were consequences. He lost the election. He lost the election overwhelmingly by millions of votes. He lost the election in the Electoral College. He is subject to being criminally prosecuted. That's not getting away with it. There's no January exception, but there's also no Donald Trump exception to the First Amendment. And you can't have different rules if you don't like a president. I don't like what this president has done. I don't like his speech. But he is as covered by the First Amendment as anybody else. If you want to amend the Constitution and say from now on, if a president violates his oath of office, he can be impeached, fine. But under the current Constitution as it's drafted, it must be treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And those criteria were simply not satisfied by the evidence presented by the House managers in this case.
Now, Professor, you've defended Trump very effectively during this interview. Reports are that you were asked to do that on the Senate floor, but you chose not to. So my question is, are those reports true? And if so, why didn't you do it?
It is true. I didn't do it because I didn't want to be in a position where I had to defend his false statements about the election. I think the election was fair. It wasn't stolen. It wasn't fraudulent. And if I'm his lawyer, I might be forced into a position where I had to defend not only his constitutional rights, but what he said on the merits. I couldn't do that. I couldn't defend his speech on the merits. So I made a decision to simply defend the Constitution in the court of public opinion by being on shows like yours, being on shows in the United States, and arguing to the American public and to the world at large how important freedom of speech is. It's important in Australia, it's important in the United States, and we can't compromise it just because we don't like the person who spoke.
Well, Professor, we're glad that you're with us and not in Washington, D.C. on the Senate floor this week. Good to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. What a pleasure to have intelligent and wise talk. Thank you.
The man loves rake.
Yeah, we'll tell Richard.
In the meantime, President Biden has said exactly zip about this impeachment trial because he's focusing on his COVID relief bill. In particular, people are negotiating Bernie Sanders' proposal to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour over the next 5 years. But as always, when you get to the Senate, things become very complicated. So what's the deal?
Here's the deal. Yes, here's the deal.
Now, back in 1963, Martin Luther King led a march on Washington to protest the abysmally low federal minimum wage of $1.15 an hour. Even worse, there was an absolute minimum wage at the time for retail service and construction workers of only $1 an hour. Although adjusted for inflation, those wages would be $9.79 and $8.51 an hour today, both more than today's actual minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. Also, disabled people have $0 for a sub-minimum wage, and tip workers have a minimum wage of $2.13 an hour. So, bottom line, the minimum wage is low, and that is even compared to other American wages. The American minimum wage is only 32% of the American median wage, and that is way more unequal than any other OECD country. Way more. Now, that might be why a higher minimum wage is so popular. 55% of voters support a $15 an hour minimum wage, but another 27% support a raise to lower than $15 an hour. In fact, since 1998, there have been 23 minimum wage ballots, and every single one of them has succeeded. Even when Trump won in Florida last year, the $15 minimum wage initiative at the same time got up by over 20 points. So why is this controversial then? Well, for decades, there's been a debate about whether raising the minimum wage leads to more unemployment, especially more than doubling the minimum wage over 5 years, which is what a $15 minimum wage would do. I'm going to spare you those details though, because the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, weighed in on this precise proposal this week, and they said that by 2031, it would raise workers' wages by $509 billion. By 2025, it would raise the wages of 17 million people earning less than $15 an hour, and also of 10 million more people earning more than $15 an hour. Also, 900,000 people would be lifted out of poverty. But 1.4 million people would be priced out of a job as well, or 0.9% of the workforce. So, is that a good trade-off for that? Either way, it doesn't matter, because to happen it would need the support of at least all 50 Democratic senators, and when asked if he supported the $15 an hour minimum wage, Joe Manchin said no. So that is that. Well, but let's say you could convince Joe Manchin to support a $15 minimum wage, let's say. Even then, Joe Biden is still pessimistic.
Apparently that's not going to occur because of the rules of the United States Senate.
So you're saying the minimum wage won't be in this?
My guess is it will not be in it.
Yeah, what he's referring to there is what they call the Byrd Rule. Now, you need that to satisfy that if you want to pass a bill with 50 Senate votes through what they call reconciliation. And by the way, guess who's in charge of that process? Mr. $15 minimum wage himself, Bernie Sanders, who, by the way, knows a thing or two about birds. So what's the problem with this Byrd Rule? Well, if you fail the Byrd test, if the minimum wage hike produces budgetary changes that are merely incidental to the non-budgetary components of the provision. You get that? It's going to affect the budget a lot, which is why Bernie is saying stuff like, well, this.
As chairman of the Budget Committee, we have a room full of lawyers working as hard as we can to make the case to the parliamentarian that, in fact, raising the minimum wage will have significant budget implications and, in fact, should be consistent with reconciliation rules.
Okay, for those who are still awake, the parliamentarian he was referring to is the referee for the Byrd Rule, not the world's worst superhero. Now, Sanders' room full of lawyers are going to point out that the CBO found a $15 minimum wage would increase the deficit by $54 billion. So that affects the budget. But it also raises wages by $509 billion. So, is the deficit part there merely incidental? You know who's going to be judging. But even if the parliamentarian is okay with all that, there's another Byrd Rule problem. If the minimum wage hike is not in the jurisdiction of the Finance Committee, which is the relevant committee. Guess what committee held a hearing just this week about raising the minimum wage? The Education and Labour Committee, the wrong committee. She is not going to be impressed. And yet, there is one more complication. When the parliamentarian rules that the minimum wage hike doesn't get past the Byrd Rule, because it will not, that is it, unless the Vice President, in her role as Senate President, unilaterally acts to overrule the parliamentarian. That's right, she can do that. It would basically destroy the filibuster and cause all kinds of chaos, but she can do that. And in fact, during the primaries, when talking about Medicare for All, Sanders said, I can tell you that a vice president in a Sanders administration will determine that Medicare for All can pass through the Senate under reconciliation and is not in violation of the rules. They'll just declare it. So, just how much do Sanders and Biden want that $15 an hour minimum wage? Because this could get willing.
Here's the deal. Yes, here's the deal.
So, how is this impeachment trial likely to play out? And what will be the longer-term impact of yet another deeply partisan battle at a time when President Biden still has hopes of trying to get cross-party support for a raft of these COVID relief measures? Or will the party in power, now the Democrats, just go it alone again? Joining us is former Democratic Senator Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota. Senator, welcome back to Planet America.
Well, it's great to be back with you.
We're all sitting here thinking that this Senate trial this week, it's a preordained outcome. It's inevitable. It's leading to an acquittal. First, do you agree with that assumption? And if so, what do your fellow Democrats hope to achieve from this process?
I absolutely agree. Whether they pick up 1 or 2 extra beyond the 5 is the question, but they aren't going to get to 17 in no small measure because they're political cowards. You can't listen to this evidence and not think that the president should be impeached and removed and never allowed to run for office again. But with that said, I think that this is not a trial for this generation. It's not a trial for this point in time. It's a trial for history. It's a trial to say we stood up for the democracy. We stood up and presented the evidence. If people didn't want to convict, that's one thing. But we are not going to go silently into the night and forget that this happened. And I think it's incredibly important to document these series of events with people who were there and do everything that we can to make sure it never happens again.
Senator, what's the point of going through this whole process, though, if you don't call witnesses and do it properly? It's like they're only telling history half the story.
I don't know that witnesses, I mean, you got to remember, everybody sitting in that chamber is a witness to what happened that day. We watched it in real time. It was incredibly compelling to tell the stories. The only witnesses I think I would have thought about calling were the true victims, which were the Capitol policemen who were injured and maimed, and the families of the people who died in this insurrection. And so they're incredibly private people. They do not want to be put on a political stage as they would see it. And so I'm sure that was part of the calculation of why you would not put those victims forth to talk about their experiences that day.
The kind of witnesses I'm thinking about are people like Mike Pence, the people who know what Donald Trump was doing at the time, the people who know what was Donald Trump watching, what was he doing when he should have been calling National Guard, the people who are actually documenting what was going on behind the scenes.
We learned from the last trial that a lot of those people wouldn't show up, and if they did, we don't know that we would get a candid story from them. I was explaining to some colleagues today that the evidence that they were presenting from newspaper accounts would not be admissible in a court of law in our country because it's called hearsay. You go to the original sources, but you got to remember this is not a typical trial. And the allegations that have been leveled against this president, I think, have been well proven. He did not act to prevent this. In fact, he incited it. But once it happened, he did nothing to stop it. And I think they have proven that over and over again, not with any third party witness, but with the words of the former president, President Trump.
We know that when it comes to the jurors, the 100 senators there, the fix is in, that this is not being addressed objectively. But what about the court of public opinion, and what are Democrats seeking to achieve there? Is this about trying to maybe win a couple of Senate seats next year? There's a lot of politics in this as well.
I think I'm from one of the reddest states in the union, and I have asked all my friends, are you watching? And they're not. Fox News is not carrying it live. That's the typical station people would be tuned into. I check my Twitter feed. A lot of this is about how we're managing COVID. So it seems like the public's already made up their mind. But remember, Donald Trump leaves office and today has the lowest favorability rating of any former president in the history of this country. He just has a very solid 30% of this country who literally would riot and move through the Capitol to defend their president as they see it. And so you aren't going to change those 30% signs, but you are documenting for the children and for the people in the future what actually happened that day. And I think that's incredibly important.
Okay, let's talk about getting things done with bipartisanship. As far as the COVID relief bill goes, Biden seems to be moving towards reconciliation at the moment, which would leave out probably all the Republicans. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think Biden is a pretty good politician. And I want you all to think about there's a bill before your parliament, and it means that low and middle income people get $1,400 in checks, and your member is going to vote against it. I think that if there is one bill where you should take it to reconciliation, I think it's this one. I think it's COVID relief. I think it played a huge role in what happened in Georgia when we picked up 2 Senate seats. We had 2 billionaires who refused to vote for COVID relief. And so I think you're going to see more Republicans actually vote for that package than what you see right now, because politically, I think it's very dangerous for them to, many of them who are millionaires and who have done just fine during the pandemic, to say no to economic relief for middle class and low income families in our country.
Which, Senator, goes to the concern that pessimists about bipartisanship raise, and they say, look, if you can't get 60 votes in total for COVID relief, forget about anything else. And using reconciliation, it's one and done. That's it. That's all you can do this year. I
think that the place that you can always get a lot of members is infrastructure. And that's going to be part of the stimulus that the president advances. Today, his great lieutenant, which is Senator Carper, who is a dear friend of President Biden, said he is going to fast track and move an infrastructure package. That is, again, where the rubber meets the road. A lot of Republican governors want that infrastructure package. A lot of members of Congress want that infrastructure package. So I think we're going to see spaces where we can do some pretty amazing things for the American public in a bipartisan way. Are you going to get all 50 Republicans? No, you don't need all 50 Republicans. You need 10. And I think you're going to find 10 Republicans who are going to vote for infrastructure.
Senator, always a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks so much. You guys take care.
Well, I don't know if they're going to find bipartisanship in the Senate, but they're definitely not going to find it on the C-SPAN open talkback line.
Although, Chaz, you and I have both done enough live TV to kind of respect how this guy handles a crazy person on the line. He just kind of pushes on through. Have a look.
John is in Wilmington, Delaware, Republican. John, what are your thoughts?
Well, I support President Trump. I think he's got to get back in there in that White House, and he can't get people like Marjorie Taylor Greene out of office. We need women like her in there. Otherwise, these Democrats are going to keep eating the babies and cutting faces off of them. We need President Trump. We elected him, and it's time to get back in there and do his job.
John, what do you think about members who voted against?
Hey, you know what we haven't mentioned for a while?
What's that?
The worst recession since the Great Depression. Yeah. The January unemployment figures came out this week, and the unemployment rate was 6.3% with 49,000 jobs created. Not fantastic. Having said that, better than last month's figures. The problem is the bigger picture. Still, 10 million fewer jobs out there than January last year. And the rate of jobs returning, have a look there. It's leveled right off. White unemployment and Asian unemployment is looking okay, but not so much Hispanic unemployment or black unemployment. Also, employment rates for wealthy people has actually risen in the last year, but middle wage employment has dropped off a little, and employment levels for poor people have dropped off by over 22% since January last year still. So that is why Joe Biden is keen on the stimulus. Although, interestingly, the CBO is projecting 4.6% growth this year and 2.9% growth next year, even without any further stimulus. And unemployment rates are also on the way down. So the question is going to be, does the stimulus go too far? And we're going to be undoubtedly returning to that question over the next few weeks.
You don't want to just answer it for us now?
No spoilers.
OK. Before we go this week, it is time once again to sort through the fake news, the spin and the flat-out lies. It's time to enter...
That's a bunch of malarkey.
And this week's first bunch of malarkey comes from the malarker-in-chief, Tucker Carlson on Fox News, who thinks there's a vast left-wing conspiracy afoot to make the January 6th attack look worse than it was, and his proof? The Black Lives Matter protests following the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis last May.
BLM and their sponsors in corporate America completely changed this country. They changed this country more in 5 months than it had changed in the previous 50 years. How'd they do that? They used the sad death of a man called George Floyd to upend our society. Months later, we learned that the story they told us about George Floyd's death was an utter lie. There was no physical evidence that George Floyd was murdered by a cop. The autopsy showed that George Floyd almost certainly died of a drug overdose, fentanyl.
Now, Tucker doesn't say how America changed so much in 5 months. Maybe it's just the election. But that claim that George Floyd died of a drug overdose and not as a result of police brutality, it's been around for a while. And as the fact checkers say, it is false. The cause of George Floyd's death, according to the medical examiner, was cardiopulmonary arrest complicating law enforcement subdual, restraint and neck compression. And he ruled it was homicide. As the defence lawyers for Derrick Chauvin, the officer charged with the homicide of Mr Floyd, have pointed out, in handwritten medical notes not part of his formal report, that medical examiner, Dr Andrew Baker, also found that Floyd had taken a large dose of fentanyl.
In another new document, Baker says that is a fatal level of fentanyl under normal circumstances. But then Baker added, "I am not saying this killed him." Defense attorneys for the officers have signaled they will argue Floyd died from the drugs and pre-existing health conditions.
So just to be clear, the doctor is not saying the drugs killed George Floyd. In simple terms, he says it was a heart attack because his neck was crushed. It was a homicide. Derrick Chauvin goes on trial next month on second-degree murder and manslaughter charges. But in the meantime, old mate Tucker maintains
Democratic partisans used a carefully concocted myth, a lie, to bum rush America into overturning the old order and handing them much more power. It worked flawlessly. So why wouldn't they do it again?
Well, it's the old play of a bad thing happened, but I'm saying it's not really happening, suggesting the Black Lives Matter protest and the January 6th attack by Trump supporters are both a Trojan horse for some kind of far-left conspiracy is, I think, the very definition of malarkey, Chaz, and pretty dangerous given the current situation as well. Begging the question, why is he doing it? Well, maybe here's why. Fox News has been shunned by Trump supporters ever since the election. Some have switched over to the even Trumpier One American News Network and Newsmax. About 1 million have just turned off their TV sets altogether. And Fox, as a result, had a daily average audience of just 1.3 million viewers in January, finishing third behind their rivals CNN and MSNBC for the first time since April 2000. Although management at Fox have got some kind of standards, they decided it is time for Lou Dobbs, the top-rating Fox business host, to move on, because there is pro-Trump and then there is Lou Dobbs.
Have a great weekend. The president makes such a thing possible for us all.
Oh, Lou.
Look, Lou Dobbs might not be on Fox News again, but Mike Lee was on Fox News this week, and it didn't work out so well when he apparently insisted that Trump should get a mulligan, that's a golf term for a second chance, for inciting a fascist mob.
Everyone makes mistakes. Everyone's entitled to a mulligan once in a while.
That's not good. But when you see a disembodied 4-second clip on Twitter, I'd beware about that. Even if it is backed up by a headline, after a headline, after a headline, all saying that Mike Lee suggested Trump should get a mulligan for the Capitol riots. So why don't we look at the context, just for once?
Sure.
Now, what was happening is they were talking about the impeachment, and then the Fox host asked Mike Lee about a series of clips from Democrats that seemingly encourage violence from their supporters. They like to do that, draw the equivalence between the two sides. Sure. Then they asked him...
Democrats are saying, of course, that is different. How do you see it?
Yeah, look, it's not different. These are outgrowths of the same natural impulse that exist from time to time among anyone in this business and in many other businesses. Look, everyone makes mistakes. Everyone's entitled to a mulligan once in a while. And I would expect that each of those individuals would take a mulligan on each of those statements, because in each instance, they're making it deeply personal. They're ceasing to make it about policy. And instead, they're talking about getting up in people's faces and making individuals feel perfectly uncomfortable. And that's not helpful.
Okay, so it's pretty clear that Lee was not distinguishing Trump from the Democrats, yes. But equally, that mulligan comment that everyone was so worried about was actually Mike Lee showing charity towards Democrats. He was being understanding and forgiving and didn't go for the partisan hit. And for that sin, he was completely misrepresented and shamed online. And that, John, is malarkey.
Yes, he won't make that mistake again, Chaz. And with that, we We're out of time for another wacky week on Planet America. We hope to see you back here at the same time next week.
Sorry, Peppers, no podcast tonight. We will be putting one out on Monday when we think this trial is going to be over. But before we go, we're going to leave you with America's ambassador to Vietnam, who's shown us to forget Republicans and Democrats. There's one thing that unites all Americans, an ability to make a goose of themselves. Bye-bye.
Now mine been on from mine to yours, from my shores to your shores, our friendship endures. U.S. and Vietnam, from now to forever, we're trusted partners, prospering together. Chúc mừng năm mới from your boy in Hanoi. Chúc mừng năm mới.